On one of those 2.5-day trips by car from Washington, Indiana to Washington, D.C., we had almost been swept up in a tornado, and my baby's sister had been close to suffering heat stroke. After escaping the storm and the heat in Columbus, Ohio, our family was on its way again. This time, my grandmother, my dad's mom, was along. We asked her to come on the trip for a couple of reasons. My sister wasn't a year old yet, and Mom and Dad thought having grandmother along might make it easier to take care of her. Additionally, along the route, my grandmother would get to see one of her sisters and 3 of her sons. Therefore, the decision to take her along seemed the right thing to do. She was the only grandparent I ever knew. Both of my mother's parents had died before I was old enough to know very much. The man I knew as my grandfather, Pop Essig, was actually my grandmother's 3rd husband. My dad's father had died when he was not quite 2 years old. My grandmother's 2nd husband, the father of my dad's 4 half-brothers, had also passed on. So when I was a little boy, the man who was my grandfather wasn't really my grandfather. He was a conductor on the B&O Railroad. My hometown was actually built because of the railroad. Its rail yard was exactly to the mile, halfway between the B&O facilities in Cincinnati and in St. Louis. The majority of people living in that town had some kind of ties to the railroad. The last Christmas that Pop Essig was alive, he bought me a little railroad engineer's outfit. I barely remember that it was gray with thin red stripes. He even gave me a replica of a railroad lantern. It was battery-powered. Just a few months after Christmas, Pop Essig died. I can still remember my mom sitting me down in one of the dining room chairs, telling me she had some bad news. I think I was 5 at the time. Yes, I can still picture that dining room and the chair and that gray day. After telling me that the man I knew as my grandfather had died, I looked up her and asked, "Mommy, is it okay if I cry?" That's about all I can remember of that day. But childhood memories of important events never leave us. Well, back to our trek across Ohio. We wanted to make Washington, Pennsylvania by nightfall because we had a reservation at the Howard Johnson's Motor Lodge there. But as we crossed the Buckeye State, there came a louder and louder whine from somewhere under the back end of the car. "The differential must need greasing," I heard my dad mumble. "I better get this fixed." In the days before the interstate highways, old US 40 went through downtown Cambridge, Ohio. As we passed through the city, my dad noticed a Buick dealership on the north side of the main drag. It was called Schick Buick. It only recently went out of business. We pulled into the dealership service area, and my dad reported the increasingly loud noise. When my dad explained that our little group was trying to make it to Washington, Pennsylvania by nightfall, another 3 hours away, the service manager agreed to stop what he was doing and look at our car. While the 5 of us sat in what I remember was a very cramped waiting room, our old Buick was hoisted high in the air. The mechanic worked for over 30 minutes, but was unable to figure out the source of the whine. The moment he came to tell us about the progress, I noticed that his eyes became transfixed on my grandmother, who was sitting patiently holding my baby's sister on her lap. "Was that woman in the back seat?" he asked. "I was," my grandmother answered, and in a typical southern Indiana, "I raised 4 sons on a farm during the Depression" attitude, she continued, "What of it?" Now, you have to realize that my grandmother was not a small woman. She was, to be gentle about it, stout. If you're old enough to remember Kate Smith or Marjorie Main, you understand what my grandmother looked like. The mechanic wondered if the added weight of my grandmother in the back seat may have caused a condition that was making the car whine. He lowered the car, my grandmother got in, and he raised the car back up to its highest position. For more than 15 minutes, he rechecked the back end parts of the car. My grandmother, whom I found out later was afraid of heights, patiently sat in the elevated car praying the rosary so loudly she could be heard all over the dealership. Finally, finding nothing drastically wrong, the mechanic, having only added some grease to the differential, lowered the car and told my dad, "Good luck, no charge." The entire episode took more than 3 hours. During much of that time, my mother and I had gone to the coffee shop of a nearby hotel. A very funny red-haired woman named Zelda was at the counter that day. Mom drank an endless supply of black coffee, and I had milk and hot buttered cinnamon toast, plate after plate after plate. Well, we eventually made it to Washington, Pennsylvania that night. The car didn't make any noise anymore, even though Grandmother was still in the back seat. My dad had the presence of mind to stop at the Howard Johnsons in Cambridge and ask them to wire the motel in Washington, Pennsylvania, informing it of our very late arrival. You have to remember, this was before the day of almost free long distance. On the next day, we made it to Washington, D.C. My grandmother had a lot of things to tell her 3 sons after we got there. There are 2 postscripts to this story. First, after we got home, while my dad was cleaning out the car, he found under one of the seats a bill for dry cleaning. It was for a man in Indianapolis. My dad found the man's phone number and called him. "Did you ever own a blue Buick?" my dad asked. "Did I?" came the reply. "I unloaded that costly mistake after having to have the rear end replaced 4 times. It seems the man was an on-the-road salesman for a major drug company, and he got rid of the car as quickly as he could once he found out he had bought a lemon. The mystery of the whining rear end was solved." Finally, a full 7 years later, I went to New York City with 3 other boys from my high school and our parish priest. We represented the state of Indiana at the National Key Club Convention. Key Club is a youth division of Kiwanis. We took turns driving. We wanted to do the trip in only 2 days. At one point, I fell asleep. The other 4 decided it was time for dinner. While I slept, they exited the interstate at Cambridge, Ohio, and parked in front of the old Cambridge coffee shop. I was rudely awakened and told it was time to eat. As I walked in, I suddenly saw a woman with a head of graying red hair. She looked up and saw me. It was Zelda. "Hey, kid, want some more toast?" she asked.